All right, I think we're all set up and recording. So, how are you guys doing? That was quite an introduction. This has been a great group. I really appreciate you guys coming out. There's all the information up there. I'm recording this, so this is for the folks at home. If they're in the Houston area, they can check out this group. Highly recommend this group, guys. It's really a lot of fun. Come check it out. That's kind of for my benefit too, just so I know where I am. I'm Matthew Groves. I'm a developer advocate for Couchbase. And that's my Twitter account there. I run a podcast and blog. It's my personal podcast and blog. If you guys want to be a guest on my podcast, I'm always looking for guests. I'd love to have you. Just spend 10, 15 minutes talking about something technology related, dev related, and that's it. So just come contact me or go to my website. You don't have to be an expert on the topic you're going to talk about. You just have to be, something interesting, some interesting technology. I'm not an expert either. I consider myself more of an enthusiast. I'm not an all-knowing guru. I don't know everything about NoSQL. So when you guys have a question, raise your hand and stop me anytime you want to. But the answer might be, if it's a broad question, it might be, let's talk about it later. Or if it's something I don't know, I'll just say, well, I don't know. I'll find out for you later. Some of the best blog post ideas I've ever gotten have come from questions I don't know the answer to. So I welcome your questions, except for this question, because I get it everywhere I go. So I've made it into a slide, just answer it preemptively. You may have heard of CouchDB before. Couchbase is not CouchDB. They share an acronym, the Couch acronym. They're both NoSQL databases. They're both open source. And they both share some open source contributors sort of early on in both their lives. Otherwise, they're not related. They're not forks of each other. One's not the commercial company for the other, nothing like that. So CouchDB is entirely the Apache Foundation, and Couchbase is Couchbase Incorporated. So it's a question I get a lot.
And the Couch has no common meaning between the two.
Yes, Couch acronym is the same between the two, right.
What does it mean?
You guys are the first ones to ever ask that question. I can't believe no one ever has.
Is that like SOFA so good, or what?
So Couch stands for Cluster of Unreliable Commodity Hardware.
Cool.
Yeah. I keep saying that's the common acronym, and you guys are literally the first who've ever asked me that. So good job for you guys.
You opened up that line.
Base stands for, it's like database, right? If you guys are on Twitter, if you could tweet something with hashtag Couchbase, a picture of something interesting you've learned or a question you have, just so my boss doesn't think I'm down here screwing around, I'd appreciate it. I did bring stickers with me, but the greedy developers in Austin took most of them. So if you really, really want a sticker, I can mail them to you. I have a whole bunch in my office at home. Just hit me on Twitter or talk to me afterwards. I will literally mail you some stickers. I have no problem doing that. If you want to besmirch your pristine laptops with stickers. Okay. So full stack development and NoSQL. If you're like me, you've gotten kind of desensitized to some of these buzzwords in here, and sometimes there's a bit of a backlash against those buzzwords. So let me just defend my choice of using this title here briefly. So full stack, the criticism there is often you're not really writing the full stack. You're not writing the operating system. You're not writing, a BIOS or drivers and things like that. So what we really mean is the application stack, right? The software that you're writing and maybe some of the scripting and deployment and DevOps stuff. That's really what we mean by that, full stack. And NoSQL is a term. If you go to couchbase.com, you'll see NoSQL on there in big letters, but it's a term I don't really like. And I work for a NoSQL company because it describes what something isn't. And that's not really useful past a marketing point of view. So there's shortcut terms or marketing terms. I don't really like them, but they are helpful because otherwise I get a title that looks like this. It's not quite as catchy. You don't have to read all that. So full stack developer. If you guys are near the middle of this diagram, I'm guessing most of you are, most of you wear lots of different hats, then I would consider you a full stack developer. If you're somewhere near the middle there. And mobile's not in the picture here, but mobile could be part of this too. Right, so you're doing all these sorts of things together. When we talk about stacks, we often see these cute little acronyms here like LAMP and mean. And the individual tools in those stacks I don't think are as important, except the meaning that they convey. The LAMP stack, sort of traditional server-heavy stack for web applications. And the mean stack is Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node. That's sort of the newer, where you have a separation. We'll talk about this more later, but a separation where it's very, divided evenly between UI and backend. So we'll talk about that some. And those newer stacks, they don't render the HTML server side. Instead, they return data via REST endpoints, and they often return JSON, like on the right side there. And so what you'll usually have to do is you'll go to a relational database and you'll join together a bunch of tables and return that data to your endpoint, the REST data to your endpoint. And so people started doing this and they said, well, why don't we just store the whole document in the database instead of a bunch of tables and we have to join together every time. And that's why NoSQL appeals a lot to these sort of newer mean stacks of web developers. So, that's why it's sort of become popular, I think. So I'm going to talk briefly about why NoSQL might be a good fit. So first of all, a disclaimer is that NoSQL is not a silver bullet. It can't always replace your relational database. Sometimes it might replace it completely. Sometimes it might just be an additional nice thing to add on to your application in addition to relational databases. These are some bullet points that sort of convey some rules of thumb about where you might use NoSQL versus a traditional relational model. But if I could paraphrase Jim Holmes, a friend of mine, the only best practice is to use your brain, right? I can't stand up here and tell you you should always use NoSQL for this or never use NoSQL for that, because I don't know your software as well as you do. If you want to look more about use cases, we have a white paper at Couchbase.com where we've listed top 10 use cases from our real customers who have either switched to NoSQL from relational or they've added NoSQL onto their application. This thing is just bothering me. I like to walk around a lot, so I'm going to move it there. So it's a free white paper. Go check it out if you're interested in learning more about that. So like AOL, PayPal, Tesco, those guys are all included there. We'll talk a lot about Couchbase tonight. It's my NoSQL database of choice. And there's a lot of similarities between Couchbase and other NoSQL document databases. Yeah?
So you mentioned that you have a white paper of use cases, and that's great. Are there any key things that would tell you, no, this really isn't an appropriate solution for a NoSQL database? On the flip side.
Yeah. So
if you're doing this, just say no to NoSQL, not appropriate.
Yeah, I'd say, again, I don't want to get too specific because I don't know your software, but I would say some things that NoSQL does well, if you don't need those things, relational database probably is fine. So if you're not having a massive need to scale out your data, if your data fits well into a relational model, you don't have to twist it around too much to really just make it fit when it doesn't really fit. That's a good place for it. If you're okay with object impedance mismatch and you're okay with using ORMs, then that's fine. Stick with relational, no problem there. You may want to add NoSQL on for something like, try it out with logs, for instance, or for a caching solution. Might be a good place to just try it out and see if it helps you. So, I don't have any, like I said, I don't have any silver bullet answers for you about when you should definitely not use it.
You use hash indexing in these and things like that?
Yes, Couchbase does. We can get into that some more if you'd like.
I would say speed. Then is,
yeah, speed is definitely an important thing. So,
is your biggest.
Yeah, so Couchbase specifically is very fast because I think this architecture. There's a built-in managed cache layer in Couchbase. So oftentimes when you're writing and reading documents from the database, you're going to be writing and reading directly from RAM, and you don't have to make that trip to disk to get those documents. So a lot of people just introduce Couchbase as a caching layer that sort of interacts with a relational database. It's a good place for it. You can also use Couchbase as a very simple key value store to just put in whatever value you want to, but the real power, I think, comes when you use it as a document database. And by document, I mean a JSON object. And so this means that because we know it's JSON and Couchbase knows we're storing JSON, it can do some server-side stuff with that JSON, just like a SQL database can do something with the tables server-side because it knows about the structure, what's going on there. We also have some mobile stuff, which I'm going to touch on briefly tonight, but I don't have a lot of time to talk about it. which, by the way, if I'm going too long, just wave your hand around.
Is JSON the internal storage format for data?
So the question was, is JSON the internal storage format for data? Yes, I believe that you could say that. Yes, it is the internal storage format. So, like for Mongo, they have a sort of a variation of JSON called Bison. It's like binary JSON, but again, it's kind of like JSON, just stored in a different way. Some document databases use XML. If you're really into XML, I'm sure there's one out there that uses YAML or something. I don't know.
So you're basically using, if I can, like a dynamic schema on the fly with JSON.
Yes.
So instead of using something like a fixed schema,
Right.
you have a very dynamic schema, and if I want, and the software on its own can say, okay, now I want this record to look like this.
Right. Yeah. So there is no Couchbase does not enforce a schema on the data you put into your documents. So that doesn't mean you can just put whatever you want in there willy-nilly. It just means that you have control of the schema instead of the database having control of the schema. Let's see. So
Each record holds its own schema.
well, that's another way of looking at it. Sure. So agility and scale are the two things that I think Couchbase can really help you with. We talked about some of these things already. We'll look at some of the really cool querying options that Couchbase has today. Mobile stuff is there. Elastic scalability. So Couchbase, like many NoSQL databases, is distributed database. So it's not just one machine, one server. It's a collection of nodes that act together as a single cluster. So if you need to increase your capacity, you can just add more nodes to your cluster. Maybe a busy time of the year, you want to increase capacity. And then if it's not so busy or after that rush is over, you can then take those nodes down and you lower your costs. Multi-data center deployment, Couchbase does this really well. It's called XDCR. Allows you to sync your data between two different geographically located data centers. So like West Coast, East Coast, you can sync them up. That's just built into Couchbase. Very cool.
How does this relate to like AWS or Azure?
How does this relate to AWS or Azure?
Yeah.
So you can run Couchbase in either of those services, certainly. You can also run it in Docker. OpenStack, maybe you could also run it in there as well. Other cloud services. Yep. So I'm going to talk about .NET tonight, but if you develop anything else, Java, Node, PHP, etc., we have an SDK for you. I'm going to talk about WebAPI tonight, ASP.NET, but if you want to use other frameworks like Nancy or MVC, totally compatible with those. I'm also going to show you Couchbase Server running on Windows, which you can do as a developer. You can also install Couchbase on Mac, and you can also install Couchbase on a lot of popular Linux distros. So lots of options there for development and deployment. Docker support as well. I'm actually running in Docker on Windows. So Azure and AWS, like you mentioned, also works there. Anybody here into big data? Do any big data stuff? 1, 2, okay. So I'm going to talk about this. What's that?
You say big data, like lots and lots of records? Or
Yeah,
lots of-
big data, it just means, well, I don't want to get into it too much, but it means basically you're ingesting, massive amounts of data and you're processing through them to maybe build some reports or some intelligence about your customers or whatever, right? So there's a lot of tools for big data. Couchbase has a lot of integrations available for that. These are all some that our customers are using or are trying out. So like Spark is a popular one, and Kafka is up there too. Solar, Elasticsearch, etc. LinkedIn, I think, is using Kafka, as a matter of fact. So here is sort of a brief overview of the Couchbase architecture. So one thing that kind of interesting about Couchbase is that each node is kind of equal importance. So there's not a situation where you have a master slave or a primary, secondary, or you have to have a load balancer and then other types of deployments. You deploy one type of node to your cluster. And so each node can be identical. You can also have some other scaling options if you want to do what's called multi-dimensional scaling. But each node has a cache that becomes part of the cluster, has a storage that gets added to the cluster. As a developer, you're interacting with the cluster manager. So when you write a new document, the cluster manager is going to take over and say, okay, which node does that document go on? And vice versa, when you say, give me this document, it'll figure out which node it should pull from. And that's all done behind the scenes. You don't have to, address each node in your own code. Your question back there?
So how does it differ from
How's it different from MapReduce? So MapReduce is a feature you can use in Couchbase. I'm going to get to that in a few slides. Yeah. Here's a screenshot of the Couchbase console. So when you install Couchbase Server, you can just access this console, like an admin console, via a web browser. This will give you some statistics about number of operations, how much RAM is being used, how much disk space, how many nodes there are, etc. There's a RESTful interface available to help write automations if you want to, or interact with Couchbase cluster. There's a whole bunch of endpoints. This is just a few of them here to access the Couchbase cluster. Okay, so in terms of actually reading and writing data, there are three methods. This is a lovely hand-drawn graphic of mine here. There's three main methods to interact with data at Couchbase, and this goes for a lot of NoSQL databases, not just Couchbase. But so for instance, I could say I want a document out of Couchbase, and I have a key. Let's say it's K2. So I say, Couchbase, give me the document for K2, and Couchbase says, okay, here you go, here's doc2. And this is the really fundamental basic interaction with Couchbase, the key operations where you're getting or writing by the key. And this is typically very, very fast because it's going to do some really quick indexing, and also it's going to typically be pulling these from RAM. If things are going well, you're going to be interacting with RAM and not having to wait on a disk operation to do this.
Are they separated into tables, or or separated? So I can say I have the same K2 in a different table or a different organization.
Right. So the question was, if I had the same K2, could I put, how can I separate that into a different storage unit? So we'll talk about that a little bit. This is what's known as a bucket in Couchbase. So each key in the bucket has to be unique.
Okay.
You can have multiple buckets, but typically buckets aren't used for a logical separation. Typically you have one bucket, a rule of thumb, per application.
Okay.
So you'd store a bunch of different types of documents in a single bucket. Okay. Now you can do multiple buckets, nothing wrong with that, but you can't put like 100 buckets on a cluster.
And from one to end, the schema is the same.
Say that again?
From one to end, the schema is the same, the layout.
So the question was, from 1 to n, is the schema the same? No. It can be absolutely completely different documents in each of those documents there.
I'm a Lotus Notes programmer too, so everything I'm looking at here is saying.
So it's funny because CouchDB, the thing I mentioned early on, was inspired by Lotus Notes early on. So Lotus Notes, possibly the most... That's CouchDB. I'm talking about Couchbase.
Actually, I disagree 100%.
I've used Lotus Notes.
Yeah. And we're talking about the Lotus Notes data store, not the email clients, right?
There are still things you can't do with without Lotus Notes until I see this.
So Lotus Notes, possibly the most commercially successful NoSQL database of all time so far. So interesting little point there. What's that?
Jay's not going to let this go.
Look, I used Lotus Notes at a consulting job years ago. I hated the email client a lot, but the data model, apparently very, very cool.
Oh yeah, you can store documents and
Sure.
Everything in it. It's just wonderful.
And the document IDs are auto-generated, right?
Say that again?
The document ID, are they auto-generated or?
The document IDs are not auto-generated, so they can be whatever you want them to be. A GUID, some sort of string, or a multi-key.
Images?
Make it automated or?
You can't. There's no auto increment ID like that. You say images as a key?
No, I don't key.
You can store an image in there.
So you can store whatever you want in the value. Typically, you're going to store JSON. That's going to give you the most power. But you could store an image in a document. But there is a limit to the size of documents in Couchbase. It's 20 meg. So.
Oh, okay.
All right. So someone mentioned. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
One question. You said Cloud Database, it can be distributed across locations, right?
Yeah, you can have a cluster here and a cluster there. Yeah.
Okay, so how does that work with these keys? Because the keys have to be unique, so...
Right. So if we're talking geographical distribution, you have two different copies of them that you can access independently. So if I'm on the West Coast, if you're serving someone a web page on the West Coast, you want to connect them to the West Coast cluster for, reduced latency. if they're on the East Coast, you want to connect them to that. That's why, Amazon and Azure had the different regions, right? To improve, well, it's one of the reasons, to improve latency to people in those areas.
And they are all active at the same time, right?
Well, I mean, again, the geographical feature I'm not really going to talk about a lot tonight, but the idea is if one of them goes down, the other one could take over, hypothetically, because they're syncing the data between them.
Replicate.
Right, replicating the data between them, sure. Now, maybe what you're getting at is within a single cluster, there are multiple nodes, and it's possible that a node could go down, right? So there are some replication options within the cluster to say, when I write a document, write the main one to this node and write some copies to other nodes. So that if this node goes down, we can still at least get a read-only view of those other documents until some sort of failover happens. Then we can promote those and start reading and writing from them. So, yeah, so good questions. Here's the MapReduce, I think you mentioned before. This is a way, so previously we were just accessing sort of one document at a time or a group of documents at a time by their key. That may be good for a lot of things, but sometimes we need to query these documents by their properties, by what's in them. So one way to do that is to create a MapReduce view, is what they're called. So I can start with, say, 3 different person documents. I'll map a couple fields from them, like a name and age, for instance. And then I'll say, okay, that's the map function. Now I have a reduce that says I only want the ones that have an age greater than 21. So this is a very simple way to query data. In Couchbase, you write these with JavaScript, and they're stored on the cluster. And then you can call them from your client code to say, execute this view, or whatever you named it. Now, this is a simple one. You could do a very complex MapReduce with whatever JavaScript you want to write. So that's one way you could write queries against Couchbase Server.
And using my Lotus Notes thing, but that's like a view, and so you're just.
Yeah, we call these views as well, yeah.
And that looks like a table, and that does look like a table. You're pulling it from a bucket, and that is like a schema.
Yeah. So the one other thing which is pretty cool and somewhat unique to Couchbase is that even though it's a NoSQL database, you can write SQL against it. So we have something called the NCL query language, which is like SQL but has some extra stuff in it to deal with unique things in JSON. But here's the MapReduce equivalent query right here. So if you guys know SQL already, and if you're like me, that's what you've been using for most of your career, then you know how to write NCL too. So I can say, do the same thing. Give me this is in case all the documents from bucket that have an age greater than 21, and it returns the same results there.
But not all of your bucket records have the same variables to it.
That's correct. That's
so
right.
You could say, you have to say select, if I said select name 1, comma name 2, comma name 3,
Yeah.
it would only get me those bucket records that had name 1, name 2, name 3 variables.
So in this case, this query is, as I've written, it's literally going to look at every document in the bucket. And it's going to say, does this document have an age greater than 21?
Right.
Regardless of whether it's a person document or not.
That's right. And it's going to return all
If
of
it doesn't have this age field, it's not going to return it.
The name field is going to be HEE.
So say that again?
It's going to have a name field of HEE and a value of greater than 21.
Right.
Well, one of the, I'm not sure if you're familiar with JSON, but one of the, JSON is just like a key value pairs,
key value.
basically. So this would be the key, and has a value greater than 21. Okay, yeah,
What
over
would
there.
happen in case where your, let's say age is a string in some,
We'll say age is what?
a string, like,
A string, okay, yeah.
so what would you do? What would you say?
So if age was a string, so I don't know if you'd get a type exception for that, but it might try to just do it alphabetically. So it might just cast this to a string and then see if it's alphabetically greater
No, what I'm
than
saying
21.
is that one of the keys of one of the documents, age is on all others, it might be an integer, but one of them is a string.
Right. Yeah. So it's probably going to try to do its best. We can try it if you want to. It's going to do its best to figure out if this is if this is a string, and this is an integer here. It's going to probably cast this to a string, and then do greater than is going to do alphabetizing, right?
So it's not all stored as strings.
Right. So JSON can be stored as strings, numbers.
When you say numbers, binary or just numbers?
So in JSON, there's a number type, because JavaScript is a number type, right? There's no integer or float, there's just number. Bool. Null is a type in there. Is that it? Is there one more? I think that's all the types in JSON.
So your result set comes back in JSON format?
That's correct. This will be in case a collection of JSON objects, and we'll definitely see some of that in action for sure.
There's such a thing as indexing.
Yes, there is such thing as indexing.
And you call each one of those a record that's returned, or what do you?
So
Documents.
I would call them documents,
That's very nice.
but in the .NET API they're called rows, unfortunately. So even though it's not a table, they're called rows.
Is what you return.
Of every document indexed?
Is every field of every document indexed? So what I think you're asking is, can you put every field into a NICL query? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I was speaking more to the efficiency of it.
Okay.
If you don't go ad hoc, this is an ad hoc kind of
Okay.
database.
Right.
So if you query anything,
Yeah.
presumably you want to do it quicker.
Yes. So every field is not indexed by default. That would probably not be optimal, but you can index whatever you want to, a field or a combination of fields, and create those indexes. Very important for getting efficient query results. Absolutely right. Okay, one more thing I wanted to say, that if you are into reporting tools like Crystal or Power BI or something, there are ODBC drivers and JDBC drivers available if that's your thing. I wouldn't use those in an app, but you can use them for reporting. Yeah.
Okay. So that was kind of unexpected. So you have ODBC and JDBC drivers.
Yep.
So those are traditional SQL based.
Yep.
Do y'all have your own special kind of flavor of SQL that gets passed through these ODBC and JDBC drivers? That seems like
Yeah.
a complete perversion.
So yes and no. It's actually not us. It's one of our partners, Simba, who creates. They do a lot of JDBC and ODBC drivers. They created one for Couchbase. By default, you pass in your ANSI SQL, SQL 92 or whatever, into that driver. It translates it into NICL, and then gets the results to your program. Now, if you want to, I don't know why you'd want to, but you could tell that ODBC driver to just run NICL direct. This is a whole another slide deck, by the way, but so it would not do the translation. It'd be a little faster, but it would run the raw NICL. But I'm not sure why you do that, because you're typically trying to integrate with a, like Access or Excel or Crystal or something, and they probably aren't executing NICL queries, right? They're doing, SQL 92 or whatever. Yeah.
How are blobs handled?
How are blobs handled? So what do you mean by a blob?
Binary large object.
Big lump
Big
of
objects.
binary.
You
So-
might
so-
have said 20 megabytes.
Right, so if I wanted to store some non-JSON value in there, you mean, or?
Be a byte array, essentially.
Yeah, it'd basically be a byte array, stores a byte array, but you wouldn't be able to use these type of queries on that, because at that point you lose the ability to do that server-side stuff, because it's no longer being stored in a well-known format. You can do it.
But you're still limited to 20 megabytes.
Yeah, it's a limit 20 megabytes per document. So we don't generally recommend you store binaries in Couchbase. You can if you want to, but
Well, it helps understand where this fits and where it doesn't fit.
sure. So our recommendation typically is you can store metadata about your files and then keep the files themselves in blob storage or AWS somewhere, or a file system, whatever.
How would you store a blob? It's because it's not a type associated with JSON.
Right, so you can store non-JSON values in Couchbase if you want to. It's just you lose that, you can't run a query like this on a binary, a byte array. Right?
Set up a blob bucket.
Right.
Yeah,
And
sure.
you would have it, and you would sequence it. And so you would have a key that gets you there,
Yeah, I know.
and it would be complex.
Sure.
How would we set it up as a blob?
Well,
There's-
I mean, it's very simple, right? I mean, there's various ways to represent a blob as a string, right? You can base 64 encoding,
Yeah. So, I mean,
and you have a conversion process.
so I just wrote a whole blog post about this on blog.couchbase.com, by the way, so you can see the code samples for that. With the .NET SDK, you can just pass a byte array right into it, and it will store that, probably as base 64 encoded in Couchbase. So
Eventually all the data will store as a string.
I think that's probably true. I don't want to say for sure, because I don't know all the details of how the system's implemented, but
Well, it's JSON, yes.
Yeah.
It's going to
Well,
It's JSON.
yeah, but you can store binary.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the question was, how do you store big binary files?
Yeah.
So I would recommend if it's, unless it's small binaries, unless you have a really good reason, don't use Couchbase for storing files and binaries.
Okay, so there is one of our
There you go.
no-use cases.
Now, there are other,
Binary data.
that's for Couchbase. There are other NoSQL databases like React or whatever that you might be smart to store large binaries in.
Is it like Lotus Notes every record that you store?
I don't know anything about Lotus Notes, man.
Oh, yeah.
I just know that it's,
Well, let me get to the question then. It has a unique document, a unique key for that particular document.
each document has a unique key,
A
yes.
unique key, and that works across every cluster. So no matter where in the world.
So not across every cluster,
Okay.
but across, within that bucket itself, the key must be unique.
Well, that key, okay. So are you giving it the key or the key
Yes,
generated?
the key is not generated.
You have no auto-generated.
That's correct. There's no auto-generation of keys.
Okay.
If you want your key to be unique across multiple buckets, just use a GUID.
Let's use a what?
Yeah, GUID would be fine, or some other
Globally unique.
generated key. That's fine. So we're going to talk about .NET a little bit here. The Couchbase client's available on NuGet.
I know GID.
I used to have to say it's only the full .NET framework, but our .NET Core preview just came out on Friday, so I had to cross this out. This might be the first NoSQL database with a .NET Core SDK, so yay for us. I can't show it to you tonight. I didn't have time to prepare that, unfortunately, but it's going to look very similar to the code I'm showing you tonight.
You got a question?
Yeah, over here.
Is there any support for transactional processing at all?
Is there any support for transactional processing at all? So, this question comes up a lot. I will say that there's no support for multi-document transactions. So you couldn't, for instance, update 2 documents and then roll both of those back. Each individual document transaction is atomic. And so this means that, with a document database, often you're going to be storing the equivalent of say 3 or 4 tables in one document. So it reduces your need to do those types of transactions. And also, if you really do need multi-document transactions, you can implement that as a design pattern in your code. But Couchbase Server itself and most NoSQL databases do not support those multi-document transactions.
So if I'm developing a banking application, I want to make sure my financial data is locked.
Yeah?
In transaction, I have to do it in a layer above, right?
I'm not going to say across the board that's true, but most likely it's true. If you definitely wanted to do a transaction, you have to implement that within your application. Yeah. We do have, Couchbase has several customers in the banking and finance space. I don't know for sure if they're using us for everything, probably not. But I'm not going to put it on the list as do not use NoSQL for banking because we do have banking customers. So I see you keeping track back there.
Financial transactions.
You'd be surprised how we often think financial transactions are very atomic, but the financial system is really kind of spread out and janky, and I think you'd be kind of surprised, maybe a little scared about how non-transactional it really is.
I believe.
Yeah. Okay, so if we're going to use that SDK, so I've got Couchbase Server installed, I've created a bucket, now I'm going to write some .NET code. These are the namespaces you would have to bring in, unless you use your sponsor, JetBrains ReSharper, and then they sort of appear automatically, which is what I like. Here are some snippets on how we interact with Couchbase and .NET. I'll go over here this time. These guys are not getting any love. So we start out by when we connect to the Couchbase cluster. So we say, okay, new client configuration, and we have to give it a list of nodes within that cluster that we want to connect to. At least one, but if you can, you want to list all of them in there, just in case one of them goes down, your application restarts, and you need to recover. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Link provider?
Every time. Last 2 times I presented, you always beat me to the punch. I've got slides for it later. You spoiled the
So I'm
surprise.
like looking at that table, I'm like going, that's so 2003.
Yeah,
So you just alluded to this.
Okay.
That essentially, if you connect to one host, I suspect on connect, it discovers the other hosts.
that is correct. So the cluster manager, once you connect to one cluster manager, it's going to figure out that, yeah, there are actually more nodes out here, and it's going to tell the SDK about them. And they're sort of going to be in constant communication, not constant, but communication with each other to know which nodes are available.
So the reason for putting in multiple nodes.
Yes.
In case you do have to restart.
Right.
Is that-
And if that node is down for whatever reason, you still want to be able to connect to the cluster in some cases. So that's probably a good idea. All right, then I initialize the cluster helper, and then from the cluster helper, I can now get a bucket object. So I say cluster helper.getBucket, and the name of the bucket. Optionally, you can have a password on buckets. So the bucket object is the thing you're going to be interacting with most of the time to get and set documents in Couchbase. This is an example of how you would create a SQL query. There is parameterization available because guess what? SQL injection is possible in a NoSQL database. So parameterize your SQL. We'll show that later. And then finally, creating a document here. I'm just doing a new document. That document type is part of Couchbase. And you can specify whatever type you want to. I did dynamic because I'm super lazy, but you'd probably want to put some sort of type in there. And then this is where you set the key of the document. In this case, I'm just saying it's my-key. Set that to a GUID or whatever you want to construct your keys as. The content itself, this can be any sort of .NET object. It's going to get serialized to JSON. So I'm just being lazy again. I used an anonymous object with 2 fields. And then finally I say bucket.insert, and that will save the document into Couchbase. All right, any questions on that? We'll dive more into that in some detail, but just to sort of dip your toe in, that's the few snippets I wanted to show you. All right. Let's go a little bit deeper now. Anybody in here comfortable with async and await yet? Okay, good. So you guys won't know how badly I'm screwing up then. You don't have to use async and await, at least not yet. With .NET Core, they're kind of pushing everything to be async, so someday you may have to finally embrace the async and await. But right now we have both synchronous and asynchronous. So if you're not comfortable, you can use a synchronous version. So let's go through this method here line by line, just to show you what it does. Get you comfortable with it. So this is a async method. It's a task that returns some object. So I'm saying task of dynamic, because again, I'm being lazy with my types. Does not have to be dynamic, not at all. So I could say query, or I could say task of type person, or probably list of person would make more sense in this case. And then there's the string I'm passing in, that's a nickel query, let's say, in this example. I can't just pass the string right to Couchbase, so I have to say query request.create, pass in the string there, and that will give me a query object. I can start using this to add parameters if I wanted to. Then I'm going to call the bucket.queryAsync method. And again, I'm using dynamic. I don't have to. I could probably say like query async person, for instance, instead. And I pass in that query there. I'm going to await this because it is a synchronous method. This returns a result object, which has information about did it succeed, what's the exception, some other information about the transaction. It also returns the actual results, which, like I said earlier, these are rows for some reason. So that's going to be, for instance, a list of dynamic objects. It could be a list of person objects or whatever type you wanted to use. That's what would be in there. That's what's getting returned. Go ahead.
If you did use a more concrete class, like
Yeah.
a person, does it just do duck typing and set whatever properties?
Oh, okay. So yeah. So in this line right here, what is kind of hidden away is that you're getting JSON, and it's deserializing it into an object. And dynamic means it's going to deserialize it into whatever the JSON is. But if it was a concrete type, it's going to match those up with normal JSON deserialization as best it can. Yeah, over there.
Just out of curiosity, are you using like another open source JSON library, or did y'all roll your own JSON?
I'm pretty sure this uses Newtonsoft.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I'm sure of it. You shouldn't use Newtonsoft because that's another dependency when you do it with NuGet. Yeah. You can, I think, if you want to, put in your own. But, well, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know, but you can. All right. So any questions on that? Again, if the async await stuff's a little scary, don't worry. You can just take off the async keyword there, or the async part of the method, and use the synchronous one.
If the specific type is specified instead of dynamic, doesn't
Yeah.
quite match up with the JSON being returned. Is it going to be an exception? What are the options here?
So I don't think there'd be an exception. It's just going to do its best to map up that type to whatever document you're querying.
Okay, so just,
And that,
Where's the mapping?
so here,
so like this, it's not really a mapping, it's more of a deserialization.
it's just deserializer. So
Yeah.
if it deserializes and the class you're requesting is different completely,
Yes.
you're just gonna get nothing,
You're going to get an object, I think, but it's going to be default values,
right?
right?
Yeah.
So nulls, or if it's integer 0 or whatever.
You won't know that something, let's say programmer made a mistake, he accidentally used the wrong class.
Yeah,
And, or went against the wrong document.
Yep.
You're just gonna get a class with all default values, right?
potentially, yes.
Or is there a way to configure so it throws an exception?
I don't know how you would do that. I mean, because Couchbase is not putting any restrictions on what you can store, I don't know if there's a way .NET could say, hey, this doesn't match up right. You probably have to put in your own logic to say, well, if all these fields are null, it might be a good place for aspect-oriented programming if you're into that. Say if all these fields are null, then something has gone wrong here. So, you know. Or maybe link to Couchbase is the solution for you. We'll look at that later. Okay, so let me just show you a demo here of, whoops, the wrong Windows shortcut, sorry. Windows P. I said Windows L instead of Windows P. Okay, so what I've got here for you is a very sophisticated application that I wrote. It's a CRUD application that keeps track of people, first name, last name, and email. You can add new people, edit them, delete them, and see a list of them here. Very, very sophisticated. So I could, for instance, add a new item here. Houston, let's do this, .NET rocks, okay. And then hdnug, hdnug.edu, org, okay? Save, and there we go, it shows up in the list, all very exciting. I could edit another record. Oh, I left the exclamation points from last time, but we'll get rid of those and save that. So it makes the change there. There's an edit, list, update, add, and we also can delete. Now, because I'm lazy, I don't have a confirmation dialog. It just immediately deletes the record. Not a good idea in a real app, but there you go. Just be careful where you're clicking. Okay, so this is an app that's running with Angular. And I'm using Angular 1 because I haven't had time to switch to Angular 2 yet. But there's nothing special about Angular. It's just, you know, the framework I've chosen. Using Angular, which is making REST requests to WebAPI endpoints, and those endpoints are interacting with Couchbase. Okay. So any questions on that so far? We're gonna look at some of the code here. Yeah.
Yeah, so right now over here, are you storing it, when you say add item, are you storing it right now on the cache, or you are storing it physically on the data?
Okay. Okay. It's a good question. Let me just show you here Couchbase. So if we go to the default bucket, you'll see that we'll have one document in here, which corresponds to that one record, right? And if I add another one, there'd be another document that would show up here. Now your question was, is it in the cache or is it on disk?
Yeah.
So the default behavior, what I'm showing in this code, is that the document gets written to the cache in memory, and then it says, okay, I'm done. You can go about your business. And then as a background process, it's going to be written to disk. And if you set it up, it's going to be replicated to other nodes as well. That's because that default behavior is there because that's the fastest thing you can do. If you want to, if you need to guarantee that is saved to disk and replicated to other nodes, with your bucket.insert, you can say, I won't consider this a success until it's saved to disk and replicated to X number of nodes. It's going to take longer, but it will give you the guarantee of that being saved to disk, for sure. So if you're really, really worried about it getting saved to disk or not, you can do that.
Where did that ID come from?
It's a GUID that's just randomly generated. Well, not randomly generated, but
It's generated for every...
you'll see the code in a minute here.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's generated by coding.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
I thought I understood you when you said it's not automatic.
Right.
Back to this space.
Okay. All right. So this is the stack I'm using. It's, like I said, it's called the mean stack in the JavaScript world, or we call it the CEAN Stack because we like to replace Mongo in that picture. In the .NET space, it's not quite a cool acronym, guys. I'm sorry. It's QA or WACA. I'm sorry, we just don't have a cool acronym. If you guys have a better idea,
I think WACA is cool.
WACA is a good acronym. WACA. It's not, it's not. Oh, it sure is keen.
Isn't that Fuzzy
WACA,
Bear?
WACA. Yeah, exactly.
Fuzzy Bear from,
Yeah. So
the Muppets?
I don't have the acronym, but this is what I'm using, Couchbase. Like I said, the individual parts aren't. Yeah, Pac-Man. There you go. The individual components aren't super important, so it doesn't have to be Angular. It could be Angular 2 or React or plain old jQuery for that matter. Typically, these types of applications, they're written with things like Angular in mind, where you have all your templates, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. That's all on the client side. So we're not doing anything with Razor or anything like that on the server side. The back end is just returning JSON data, and it's being consumed by the front end. And the front end is posting JSON data to the back end. And so we have that sort of, the only thing that's coupling them together is that REST API. So hypothetically, we could switch out the front end for a different tool and keep the back end and vice versa. More realistically, we could reuse that same API across multiple apps. So we could use it on our web app, our mobile app, our desktop app. So if I made a purchase on the website and then I later open up the desktop app, it's using the same API, so it shows up in both places. Great. So let's take a look at the Angular JS front end. Like I said, this is Angular 1. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
That begs the question, does a Couchbase node expose REST endpoint directly?
So yeah, so I showed earlier that there's a REST API to Couchbase, but I would not recommend I don't think you can actually use it to store data from, let's say, a JavaScript app.
Don't use it as your web server.
Right. It would at least be a CORS problem. If you could get around that, then I don't think the API is even there for you to do those type of operations. That's a whole security concern right there, I'm sure. But here's an Angular app. So I have a fetch all method I've defined on scope, and it's just making a call to the endpoint using the HTTP dependency, which is like an AJAX call, to the API/get all. On success, that's a promise there instead of a callback. On success, it's going to loop through those results, put them into an array called items with the key value from the document database. So the key is the key of the hash or dictionary sort of thing, and then the result is the document. And then there's an error. If an error happens, we'll just write to console. The UI that corresponds to that would be in a template called like list HTML, for instance. And this looks a lot like HTML, but it's got Angular stuff in there, like the ng repeat. It's kind of a loop. Kind of looks like mustache, if you're familiar with that, as a client-side template. And then there's edit and delete buttons there that use some functions, which I didn't show you the code for that, but you can imagine that they're very similar to what we just saw. And that's going to get rendered to the browser, which you already saw that one. And then here is if I want to edit or add a new item, this would be the HTML for that. Again, very much like regular HTML. There are a couple of things like ng model that bind it to an Angular or to a JavaScript object for Angular, and a click event, which will pass those values into the method. That's one way you can do it. There's other ways to do this in Angular. And that save method looks like this, which, again, very similar. It's just using the HTTP component to post a JSON string to that endpoint. And you can see here that I'm mapping those fields from the form, first name, last name, email. I'm also going to map the document ID, which corresponds to the key in Couchbase. If I'm adding a new person, I don't have that key, so this is going to be undefined. So we need to handle that on the server side, which we'll see shortly. But if we're editing, the key is going to be defined, and we're passing that key so it knows which document to update. And then again, we have the success and error promises that handle what happens when that method is done running. Okay. So I have an Angular 2 code, but it's in a Node app. So if you guys really want to see it, I can show it to you later. Angular 2 and Angular 1 are pretty wildly different, except for, well, even the HTML, it's different. Not wildly different, but different. Okay. All right, so let's look at, if you have any more Angular questions, go ahead and ask any time, but I'm going to go on to the WebAPI backend. And we'll start at the most exciting part of the WebAPI app, which is the web config file. I have a couple of settings that was a joke. Come on. You guys are excited about web config files, huh? Anyway, I have two fields in there. One is the location of the node, and one is the name of the bucket, which I'm calling default in this case. So I'm going to reference those later. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you all work with connection strings keys as well, or is that just not? You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah,
Connection strings.
it's another part of web config.
Yeah.
I don't see why not. I mean, this is just arbitrary config that I've put in there. Actually, I think we might even have part of the SDK that can read like a Couchbase defined part of the web config, because there are more configuration options than just node and bucket name.
Yeah. Well, for security sensitive stuff, app settings is really not a good place to put it. You
Okay.
can put it in a separate section that you can encrypt.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, I'm sure that's possible.
Oh, I think the .NET Core, this web config is going to set up.
That's true. With .NET Core, there's not a web config. So.
Completely different piece.
Yeah.
Concerns me as a different parts of that.
And then the second most exciting part of WebAPI app is the global ASAX config, or CS, and then you see those first 5 lines are pretty standard. If you do a file new, you'll get those. The next part, we've already kind of seen that. This time I'm using Configuration Manager to put app settings into the client configuration there, and initializing the cluster helper. So kind of what we've seen before, but now I'm just dropping it into WebAPI. And at the end, it's probably a good idea to clean up your cluster in case there's any lingering connections and your app is closing. So pretty standard stuff there. All right, on to a API controller. Yeah, go ahead.
What is the potential damage done if you don't do that?
I don't know. Probably not a big deal, but probably is a good idea to close cluster helper. I've never tried it. So.
That would be like the first thing I would do.
Okay.
Because that's just how I like it.
Ah, I'm starting to see that.
Running forever.
And then just suddenly, kill it and not close, and like while I'm in the middle of writing.
Yeah. So I think hypothetically it could, if you restart the app again, it could now have a bunch of connections that are still open that are basically not being used. So hypothetically, if you did that multiple times, restart your app and not closing it.
Denial of service against the server.
I don't know about denial of service, but it could lead to an exception being thrown.
The denial of service would be you run out of connections.
Right.
Right. Yeah, I guess hypothetically
To the database
it's possible.
because it's got open sockets that there's zombies on the other end.
I
Go
can
ahead.
answer some of that.
Okay.
I can answer some of that. Well, so all of the connections will get dropped if your process dies. That's just basic
long
operating
does it
system
take?
functionality. It's immediate.
Okay.
So your process dies, all the sockets that it had open close, the TCP connection closes, and whatever server it was connected to is going to get the connection drop as well, unless something goes wonky on the network. So,
Okay. So you use Couchbase before? Or is this just like in SQL?
That's just general functionality.
Okay, all right,
Connections, TCP connections.
Okay, cool.
So,
Cool.
Well, yeah, but there's typically resources associated with those connections that are server side that may stick around even after that hard TCP connection is dropped.
So when the drop occurs, when the client OS drops it, there is a packet that goes to the server that closes the connection. Like I said, unless the host operating system goes down dirty, but if the host operating system goes down dirty, depending on the routers you've got in between, those can drop the connection.
If your host operating system goes down dirty, your application closes and going to get called anyway. So that's kind of by then you're totally screwed. So
Anyway, I would expect it to be similar to like if you don't close your other database connections. Like you can do the same thing with ADO.NET, right? Don't close your connection, just kill the thing. And It cleans up on the server side.
What if
Okay.
the network goes down eventually?
What was the question?
Network goes down.
If the network goes down, well, I mean, we're all out of luck. The network goes down. All right, so this is a very sort of basic part of a controller here. I have an object called of type record model, which I haven't shown you yet, but we'll get to that. I'm moving that up in the controller. Probably a good place to use dependency inversion or an IOC tool, but I just want to keep this nice and clean, so I'm omitting that here. But do that, because otherwise, if you have a bunch of controllers, you're going to end up with a bunch of copy-paste code and tight coupling. So use IOC like structure map, for instance. So here is an actual endpoint now in WebAPI. So I'm using the route attribute on here just to be explicit about what this action is. You don't have to, but it's good in the slide. This is a post, so I'm putting the post attribute up there. This is also async. You don't have to be, but it is async in this example here. And it's going to be saving, and you're posting a JSON object that represents person to this endpoint. So the model binder is going to take that JSON and map it to person as best it can. So kind of like what we saw earlier with the serialization, but not exactly the same thing. And then I'm just doing some really basic validation just to make sure that those fields have something in them. Returning a 400 if they don't have one of those fields. Just some really, probably not the best validation there, but just to show you that that'd be a good place for it. And finally, I'm going to say, all right, call the model.save method to save this person to Couchbase. So we're still not even touching Couchbase yet. We're still just in Web API land. Just want to show you that these API endpoints should be as thin as possible. It should just be like traffic cops. Take in the request, send it off to some other service or model, and then return the result to the user. Always a good idea to do that. Here's another endpoint. Oh, what happened here? This is for getting a single document by its key, by its document ID. And just a different URL there. I'm doing some validation to make sure that the key is actually passed in. You didn't just hit this in a browser and forget to put in a key, and that'll return a bad request. Otherwise, again, we're going to delegate off to the model to get by the document ID. And finally, hope you're seeing the pattern now as a delete endpoint, which actually I'm using post on. You don't have to. You can use a delete verb if you want to be more semantically correct. In this case, I'm getting the whole person object, but I am checking to see if the document has a value, again, because I need a document key to delete a document. And I pass that into the record model. I'm not going to show you every single endpoint, but those hopefully enough for you to get the idea of what's going on there. Any questions on Web API? Yeah?
Can I get the definition on underscore model?
Yeah, we're going to get to that next. Yes. Okay. Over to record model. So I have one method in there called save. It's also asynchronous. In this case, I'm going to new up a document. So we saw this snippet a little earlier. This is very similar to that. I'm going to new up a Couchbase document of type dynamic because I could make it person, but I'm just kind of being lazy here. And I'm setting the ID equal to, now hopefully you guys have seen this new C# syntax. Are you guys familiar with this operator here? Question mark period? Who is not familiar with that one? Okay, so it's new to C#, 6? And what that means is that it's going to, normally you have a dot here, right, to say toString, but what if document ID was null? Then toString would throw a null reference exception. So what this does is say, well, if this is null, then don't call this, just return null. So we're avoiding a null reference exception there. Okay? That's called the, sorry?
The else operator?
Else operator? No, it's called the null.
First it was called else operator.
No, it's not null coalesce. Null coalesce is this one here.
Yeah, question is don't coalesce.
It's called the, oh, man, I can never remember this. Null something. Someone look it up and let us know what it is. Anyway, I'm going to show you, well, I don't have it on this slide deck, but I could show you an example of without using the fancy syntax. And then the null coalesce operator, that's actually been around since C# 2. Did you guys know that? I thought it was a lot newer than that, but it's been around for a long time. This just says, if this whole left side is null, return this right side instead. So if there is no document ID, generate a new GUID and use that. So this is where we're adding a new document. Otherwise, we're updating an existing document. Okay? And then content, I could just say content equals data if I wanted to. Totally allowed, because I could just serialize data into JSON. I've made
Null conditional.
What's that?
It's called the null.
Null conditional operator. Question mark dot. Null conditional. Null conditional. Null conditional. Okay. So I could just pass data right into here, but I've chosen to map these fields one by one, partly for illustration, but partly just because, if someone changes that person type, adding new fields, maybe I don't want to save those into the database just yet. So I'm explicitly saying which fields I want to save, and I'm also putting this field in here called type. Nothing magical about this field type. It could be called foo or whatever you want. But I want to potentially delineate these types of documents from other types of documents in the bucket. So one way to do that, one popular way to do that, is to say type equals user. So you're just storing that in the database.
It's metadata.
It's kind of like metadata, but it's stored in the actual document itself. Yeah, like there's nothing magical.
Creating records. So there's your schema. If it has a type user, it's kind of a first name, last name.
Yeah, kind of like a schema, right? And then finally, I would say bucket.upsert.
Dynamics.
Upsert is a combination of the words update and insert. So if this is a document that already exists, it will update it. If it doesn't exist, it will insert it. So it's kind of like a merge operation, or we call it upsert.
Can you do partial? Can I update just first names?
So the question was, can I update just first name? With Couchbase 4.5, we have this new thing called the sub-document API, so you can update parts of documents. Yes, but that takes a little more work than this.
So how do you know if the document hasn't changed since you last?
Right, so you're talking about, so in Couchbase Server there's something called optimistic concurrency. So when you get a document out, you can get what's called a CAS value, CAS. I don't know, that might be Couchbase specific, but it's common among NoSQL databases, and it's a number. And when you're inserting, you can pass that number into this. And if it's the same, it'll say, okay, I'll accept it and replace. If it's different, it'll return an error and say, hey, maybe you should get the latest version.
Yeah, one question there.
Yeah.
Instead of, if you didn't pass dynamic and pass some class, doesn't change anything. Like, I know in mobile you have C# driver, they automatically store some type info if you pass that class. So you can query for object of that class without writing that type equals user.
Yeah.
Get my point? If I
Not
said
quite.
document equals new document of type user, it'll automatically add that type.
Oh, okay. So the question was, will this type be automatically added if I said new type or a new user, for instance?
Well, yeah, my question is, if you provided a type, like
Yeah.
a strong Z type
Yeah.
instead of dynamic, what difference does it make?
It would make, in that case, it would make no difference. It's just going to serialize that object into JSON. So now when we get to link to Couchbase, it might be a little different. But there's nothing magical about this type field in this case right here. And Couchbase does not consider this special at all. It's just the same as a first name field as far as Couchbase is concerned. Yeah?
The new feature that you mentioned for allowing you to modify part of the document,
Right.
does that use JSON patch syntax?
Okay, so there's a sub-document API use JSON patch syntax, and I'm not familiar with JSON patch syntax, but I don't think it uses that.
Okay.
There's
a standard for it.
Okay. Very interesting. I should probably write that down. I did a blog post recently on using the sub-document API, but JSON patch syntax, I'm going to look that up. Maybe write a blog post about it. Thank you. Okay, all right. So we already saw this before, but if I store in the document, it will look like this. Oh, sorry, another question.
Your slide, the underscore bucket object.
Yes.
Was that specific to a document on the server? Like, how does it know where to put that data in? Is that because the underscore bucket knows what?
Does it know where to put the data in, like in which bucket to put it in? Yes. So earlier we said, I guess I didn't.
You didn't
Yeah, I think
show us pulling the values out of the document.
Didn't I show that? Let's see. Oh, I didn't. I guess I didn't show it here. Yeah. Okay. It's in record model. So in the constructor of record model, it says bucket equals get bucket of a default or my bucket name. So I omitted that. I'm sorry. But yeah, the bucket knows which bucket to put it into. Where was I? Right here. Yeah. So this is just a view of that. Okay, go ahead.
Can
Can you save non-persistent data?
Can you save non-persistent data?
And calculate data, but it's stored, it's calculated when you retrieve it.
Can you store data that's calculated when you retrieve it?
Right, and non-persistent.
I don't. No, I don't think you can store that. Now, in the case of if you wanted to create one of those map-reduce views, that could perform some calculations. You could call one of those views.
On the view?
Yes, but you have to define that view. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the other thing you could do is whatever value object you're deserializing the stuff into could have logic in it.
Yes, that's true.
Navigator, which does the calculation.
Yes, that's true. So your C# would be doing the value calculation, but it wouldn't be stored in Couchbase.
You have to do for every single application.
Yes, that's good. That's correct.
And SQL Server, you don't have to do it, you get automatic.
That's correct.
SQL Server.
Yes.
So view would be the equivalent, like you said.
Yeah, it would be the closest thing to that, probably. Yeah, right there.
You have attributes for your classes to control what gets serialized and what doesn't? Because, for example, if you're using Newtonsoft, right?
Yeah.
Newtonsoft has its own rich set of
Right.
attributes to.
Yes. So the question was, can you use attributes like the Newtonsoft attributes for controlling what gets serialized and what doesn't? Yes.
Okay, so that would answer your question.
Well, I don't think that's quite what he's asking. You wouldn't serialize it, but he was asking if you can store something that's computed in the database, right? Like there's a function you're storing, if I'm understanding you correctly. Like if I wanted to store a first name plus last name.
Well, what you would do is you would have a calculated property, and based on your.
In the C# class, right? But that wouldn't be stored in Couchbase though, right? Okay. All right, I think we're on the same page. Okay. Now let's look at another method in that record model. This one's called getByDocumentID. It's pulling out a document by its ID. And I've chosen to use Nickel for this, which is the SQL superset that we use. And so I'm creating a string here that's just a SQL string. It's going to select from the bucket name, which is default, I think, in this case. And then we have this new meta keyword in Nickel that gives us metadata about the documents. One of those things is the key itself. So the key is not part of the document, it's metadata about the document. And then $1 is my parameter, which I'm going to add here, positional parameter, document ID. So this is going to return either a collection of either 0 or 1 documents corresponding to that key. All right? And then I do that by saying query and pass in the query there.
Can you make up your own list of metadata on a document?
Can you make your own list of metadata on a document? I don't think so. Not in Couchbase anyway. Now, you can store whatever you want in the document itself, but it's not classified as anything different. So this operation, I showed you it in Nickel, but don't do this exact thing in Nickel. There's a bucket.get, which you can get a document by ID, which is much faster. You don't have to write a bunch of Nickel for that. But I wanted to just introduce you to Nickel in a very sort of simple, straightforward way. I'm going to get into some more complex stuff here in a second. Delete. Here's some more new C# syntax, if you guys aren't familiar. The little arrow there. Help us write our methods more succinctly. All you do is just call bucket.remove, pass in the key, and the document gets deleted. This is what it looks like in the boring old C# syntax. Extra braces and return statements. But functionally the same thing. All right. So any questions so far before we go into some more complex Nickel? Okay. All right. So how are we doing on time? I don't want to keep you guys longer than, I don't want to keep you hostage, but I have a lot of content here, so.
Mommy yells at me if I go to bed like.
She does, okay. All right.
How far through this are we?
Well, I mean, this is sort of the last stretch of it here. I can either show you some like live examples, or I can show you some slides, or I can do both. So which one would you guys like to see?
Keep on going, Bruce. Yeah, I'm like Bruce Springsteen.
Slides? Examples, okay. Okay, so I'll skip past this stuff here, and we'll go right to a complex example right here. Okay. All right, so we're going to actually bring up Couchbase. You guys can see that there, right? I go to this query tab. This is kind of like running a query in SQL Server Management Studio. You execute a query, you get the results. So I'm going to show some interesting queries here. Now there's a when you install Couchbase Server, you can optionally install a sample data set, sample data bucket called Travel Sample, which has 32,000 documents with travel stuff like airlines, airports, landmarks, cool stuff like that. It's great for playing around with Nickel or just getting your feet wet with Couchbase. So I've written a query here that's going to give me all the routes that go between two airports, San Francisco and Miami. Okay? So I'm selecting those fields. I'm aliasing them as R. Can you guys read that in the back okay? Is that good enough font? And I'm saying from the travel sample bucket, I'm going to alias that bucket as R and then apply some conditions to it, where the source airport is SFO and the destination is MIA. I'm selecting all these fields, and they're all prefixed with R across the board here. Okay? So execute that, and I get back a result count of 3. So I'm getting 3 records back, 3 JSON documents back. And, oh, I should have showed you the JSON view first. This is what you actually get back. A collection of 3 JSON objects. So there's the first one. And there's the second one, and the third one. Okay? It's a little easier to see in the table view, maybe, in this case. But there's 3 kind of rows here. They're not really rows, but they look like rows here. Here's the first one. It's for airline _439. So this is kind of like a foreign key. We don't know what airline this is yet. We just don't have the key for it. There's the first one. There's the second one, 5265. And there's the third one, 24. All right? So that's a really sort of basic, straightforward SQL query there, right? Let's get a little more crazy. We'll try join, which are pretty uncommon in NoSQL databases, in my experience so far. Couchbase does have them. So I have this airline 439 here. I want to join that to the corresponding airline documents to get the airline name, right? Like American or United or whatever. So to do that, I say this part right here. Join, again, to the same bucket, but let's alias it differently as A this time. And we're going to join the keys from airline ID in R to the key of another document. Okay? So we'd expect to see this, and I'm also saying give me a.name instead of r.airline ID. Right? Pretty standard stuff in SQL, except we're using documents this time. So now we get a name here, American Airlines. And down here we get US Airways. And the more astute of you may notice something else happened here. Anything? There's only 2 results. You have your question?
So airline ID is not a document ID, right?
Airline ID is a document ID, yes.
So it's an inner join.
There's only 2 results because there's an inner join, so I could also say left join. I don't know if they did this on purpose, but they left out one in the table there. So in this case, now I have 3 results, but now there's no name here because there's a missing document. Might have been on purpose to demonstrate this exact thing. It's a mystery. But there you go, same sort of thing. So we kind of have what we want there. We have some flights for 2 different destinations. Maybe I'm browsing a travel site. I want to know which flights I can take or how much they cost, and so on.
Is there a pivot? Can I do pivots?
Is there a pivot?
Yeah, can I pivot?
So what do you mean? What would a pivot look like?
Transform your rows become columns.
Rows become columns. So I don't think there's a
In T-SQL, for example, there's a pivot.
yeah. I don't think there's a pivot keyword in Nickel yet. I'm not sure about that. But let me show you something else interesting here, though.
You said superset.
Yes, superset. So superset doesn't mean of T-SQL. It means superset of SQL. I don't know if pivot is a standard SQL keyword or not, but
I don't think it is. I
Yeah.
think it's Microsoft only, isn't it?
Oracle might have one too.
Yeah,
But they have
I
different
think each
applications.
vendor has their own particular flavor.
Right.
Yeah, Oracle has its flavor of pivot. I forget what they call it,
Yeah.
but it does the same functional thing.
This is in your utility here.
This is the Couchbase console.
Okay, can I do this in my program?
Yes, you can. I showed you just in a few slides back how you can run a SQL query in your program, or a Nickel query. I'm sorry.
This right here is generated with Angular.
This is nothing you had to write. I had to write. This comes with Couchbase. It does use Angular, by the way. That's sort of immaterial, though. It's a UI that comes with Couchbase.
So it's for grabbing records.
I mean, this is called the query workbench. It's for, testing out queries and seeing how they work and make sure the indexes work correctly and the whole thing. Okay, so we've got a result. We've got 3 results now. We've got this schedule field here. If you look at the schedule field, it's an array of JSON objects. So there is day 0 flight, there's another day 0 flight, and so on, right? And that might be fine. We might be able to work with that. But there's another option. We can actually do a join to this sort of subtable within the document. And this is unique to JSON. This is sort of that superset part of it. This is called an unnest. So I'm going to unnest that r.schedule field into a field I'm just alias as s. And then at the top, I'm going to select s.flight and s.utc time. So I would expect to, what would you expect to see if I run this? If I've described it correctly. What's that?
A lot more rows.
A lot more rows. That's exactly right, because it's a join. But it's kind of like an internal join. So now we're going to get 52 results. Yeah, it's kind of like a cross join, but it's internal to the document itself. So
Completely unnested the entire schedule, not just the
yeah,
pieces you were interested in.
that's correct. And unnested that whole schedule array. Yeah. So you can see that most of these rows, most of the fields look the same except for like the flight number and the UTC. So there's American Airlines and there is US Airways. All right. And if I want to take it, just to finish the thought here, I'm a consumer. I want to know what flights are going out on Sunday. So I can say and day equals 0, execute this, and now we have 9 results. So here's all the flights from San Francisco to Miami on Sunday and their times. So that might be a very useful, practical query to run. Yeah.
What about other common things like count, group by, having?
Yep, you get all the aggregate function you'd expect, counts in there, max, min. There's some other cool stuff like to work with arrays in JSON. So you may want to say, give me all the documents where this particular array has one item that matches, at least one that matches, or all of them match some criteria. That's kind of unique to Nickel. Some unique syntax there. Having is there. Insert, update, delete, merge, those are all in there as well.
Can you go back to the JSON for this again?
Sure. So you can see it's definitely kind of flattened out there, the JSON. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there any kind of XPath-like syntax available?
So it's not XPath, thank God, but there is.
That's why I said XPath-like.
There is, because it's JSON. Again, you have to be able to address those hierarchies and those arrays. So there's dotted syntax and array syntax. That's all part of Nickel. That's all in there. So if name had, like a first name field, you do like that.
How big a check do you have to write for this?
How big a check do you have to write for this? You can write me a check right now. I'll take whatever you want to give me.
Is there a free version, a limited version for?
There is a free open source version of Couchbase called Community Edition. That's what it's.
That was the most important question.
It's free to use. It's also free to use in production. LinkedIn uses it, in fact, in production. We also have an enterprise edition, which comes with supports. The community edition is actually a release behind the enterprise edition, typically. So there's some more features in the enterprise edition that are restricted to enterprise, some of the more powerful features. Sorry?
You get bug fixes and stuff?
All bug fixes go into the same code base, so it's just a matter of releases, right? We have the cadence is typically one release behind, with maybe some exceptions.
Your revenue model is, of course, based upon the support that you sell.
A support, and also our enterprise model has a paid license as well. Now, if you guys want to try out those features, go ahead and download the enterprise edition. Use it on your local machine as much as you want to. Just don't put it in production. Otherwise, you need a license. But you can play with it all you want to. Yeah, go ahead.
So multi-master replication is out of the box, right?
Multi-master replication.
Within a cluster, since it's a multi-master cluster.
Okay.
Meaning you can write to any node?
You can write to any node, but you can't pick which node it goes on.
Right.
Yeah.
What about the replication over like WANs?
Replication over WAN, so that's XDCR is what we call that.
And is that enterprise functionality?
That might be enterprise functionality, actually.
Seems like
Yeah, that might be, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, over here.
Does it handle transaction isolation?
I think that question already came up, not between multiple documents, no. In a single document is an atomic transaction, yeah.
No. The SQL show what metro when you query, we don't get the you don't read when you query the same thing again. Okay, in SQL Server, when you do a query, right?
Yeah.
You query, right?
Yes.
And someone else doing the update, you query
Yes.
again, you're supposed to get the same result instead of different data, you could get into your query result.
So,
That's a transaction.
Transaction.
yeah, I think that's what you're talking about. So so let's say the update's taking a long time. It's updating one document at a time. Right, so let's say you update 1,000 documents. It's going to update one at a time. So if you're running a SQL at the same time, some of those objects are maybe not updated yet, and some of them may not be indexed yet. So yeah, you may get different results as you're doing those.
You can handle the transaction isolation.
So I
Right.
think I can partially answer that question. So the functionality you're talking about was multiple queries within the same transaction. Essentially, I run a query inside of the transaction, and then later within that same transaction, I get the same answers I got before.
Oh.
We're supposed to want the same result, not.
Yes, but
Yeah.
bear in mind that there is not the concept of that kind of transaction
Right.
here. These are just atomic commits.
Yes. So each document read and write is atomic unto itself, not a group of them. So for instance, if I were updating 1,000 documents with an update statement, if it fails halfway through, those first 500 still happen. So the whole thing does not get rolled back.
No, my question not about that.
I'm just adding that as an example. So yeah, yeah. There's no transaction. Yeah, that's very common among NoSQL databases, not just Couchbase. Was there another question over here?
If we do 2,000 inserts, JSON documents of the size of a kilobyte in 1 second.
Very specific question. I don't know. Maybe. We could try it. Probably not on this machine, because I got it in a Docker container on a machine running like 1,000 different programs. So.
Well, for things like inserts and that kind of stuff, what is your limiting factor? Is it disk speed?
Well, like I said, usually you're going to be writing to RAM.
Okay.
So it's going to be, RAM is going to be a limiting factor. So if you're doing a lot of writes, you probably want to have more and more clusters to add more RAM to that cluster.
Okay. But I mean, at some point in time, it's backed by disk, right?
Yes, but that by default that's handled in the background as it goes into a queue and gets added to a disk later.
Okay.
Unless you specify otherwise and say it must go to disk, otherwise it's not. I don't consider it successful. Right.
Okay, so then how do you guarantee an atomic transaction if you don't ensure that at least the log is a synchronous disk write?
Well, you can guarantee. So you can guarantee okay, that may be too deep of a question for me to answer.
Because if you look at a traditional RDBMS, right?
Yeah.
The data itself may not get written to the disk immediately, right? They all have lazy writer processes, which is exactly what you described. But when you issue an insert, update, delete, any type of operation that modifies data, the log and the write to the transaction log is synchronous, right? Your
Okay.
transaction does not return until that log has been written to disk.
Okay.
And that's how it guarantees atomicity.
Okay.
Right? Because you can always recover from the log, even if you die and the lazy writer hasn't written it to the final
Sure.
storage. Right? You come back up, you recover your logs, and you're good
I
to
see.
go. So if you're telling me that everything is a lazy writer in the background, you can't tell me that you actually have an atomic transaction on the document.
Okay. So I may be oversimplifying then, but there may be some of the details. We can certainly look into those at a later point.
You answered this question earlier, right? So when writing a document,
Yes.
you have the option of
Right.
telling it to flush
Yes.
and how many nodes it should replicate.
Right. So you do have that option to do that, but by default it's not going to do that. But you can certainly specify this must write to disk and this must replicate n number of
Right,
times.
yes.
So you can specify that.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So when you wake up, when your server wakes up, it knows it had a catastrophe and tries to let you know when you recover?
So when your server wakes up,
And this is what we're talking about here, is a while ago you kind of brushed past it, but,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you have a power chop, and you're down or whatever,
Yeah,
and the server comes back,
yeah.
do you know and do you go run around and repair?
So there's lots of options here. The most common thing that usually works is you can turn on what's called auto failover. So if you have 10 nodes, one of those nodes goes down, someone tripped over a power cord or network switch is broken or something like that, that node goes away. The rest of the nodes are going to look for that node, and they're eventually going to determine that, hey, this node is down. All right, this node has failed. If you have auto failover turned on and you have replication, those documents are still alive on other nodes. And so you can say, okay, that node's gone. I'm going to rebalance to now I'm a 9-node cluster. I'm going to take those replicas and make them active documents. So that's going to take some time between that fail node and the rebalancing. But in the meantime, you can't write to those documents. You can get read-only views of them until the rebalancing is complete.
In a new document, if I have a new document between the time I write it in my program and the time you write it to the disk, we lose the server. What happens?
If you haven't,
I guess he was.
oh, okay. So if I see. Well, certainly there's always a small window somewhere where the electricity gets cut off and the thing doesn't go through. But most of the time, if you want to guarantee it's written to disk, you can say, write this document, and unless it gets written to disk, return an error to me, right? Or unless it gets replicated to these 1, 2, or 3 nodes, return an error to me. And so it's going to do its best to make sure that document gets persisted to the level you want it to be persisted. But by default, it's going to stick it into RAM and then put it into a queue to write to disk later, to give you some speed.
So when you come back up, do you look at the queue?
I think so in that case, your node is, you don't have auto failover turned on. Your node is just failing, and so it's going to sit there, and you want it to notify your sysadmin probably that, hey, this node's down, better do something about it. He goes back in, plugs it back into the power source or fixes the switch. The node comes back online and operations resume as normal. All right. Okay, so let's, I think that's enough nickel for now. Let's wrap up here. I'll be around as long as you guys want to talk and answer questions until they boot me out. But I don't want to hold you hostage here. You can go see the whole source code for this app I showed you on GitHub there at Couchbase Labs. That's an example in .NET. Look for a .NET Core Angular 2 example to be on there soon. There's also Node examples, Java examples, probably Python and other languages out there too. And if you're interested more in Nickel, there's an online interactive tutorial where you can follow along, type in Nickel commands, experiment with Nickel as if it were a real bucket. You don't have to install Couchbase to try this, just go to that web address there. Now, not everything is enabled because we don't want you, doing anything malicious to our data, but most of the things are enabled there, so you can check that out. And the big anticlimactic reveal, we have an open source product called, open source library called Link to Couchbase. It's not a product yet. It's not officially supported by Couchbase yet. It's a community supported thing. It's also available on GitHub there, also available on NuGet. So you can do something like this, create a POCO in .NET, like this example here. This corresponds to an airline in the travel sample. And there are those, JSON ignore anyway is one of the attributes we were talking about earlier with Newtonsoft. And I can also put that document type filter up there, optionally. And I'll show you why that's optional in a second here.
Can you go back to that URL?
Sure. Let's just link the number 2, Couchbase. You can find it on NuGet as well. And then if I have an object like this, if I have link to Couchbase installed, I can then run a link query by saying bucket.query, the type, the POCO, and then, for instance, I could say, I'll select the airline name from that. And I can do other cool stuff in here, like a where clause, your standard link stuff. Now, one thing I've got there is that where type equals airline. I've got that crossed out because if I use this attribute up there, link to Couchbase will automatically generate that for me. If I don't put that attribute up there, then I need to put where type equals airline. Otherwise, it's going to try to get all the documents from the bucket, like landmarks and airports, and try to stick them into an airline object, and that just doesn't make sense. So you have to do one or the other. Now, and so in this case, the type field is magical because link to Couchbase has given it magical properties. But Couchbase Server itself does not consider type any different than any other field. All right. Okay, that's all the Couchbase Server. I want to touch briefly on Couchbase Mobile, because it's pretty cool. We have an embedded database. You can store data on your mobile devices, your IoT devices, etc. You can write to it while your phone's offline, so it doesn't have to connect to the internet. You can just store your data there. When it comes back online, you can optionally connect it to Sync Gateway to sync data to and from a cloud source like Couchbase Server and to other phones. So that's pretty cool. I don't have time to show you an example of that, but if you go to Couchbase Labs, there's a Xamarin example out there that's showing this off, showing Sync Gateway and Couchbase Lite. It's pretty cool if you guys are interested in Xamarin. Also, if you're interested in Xamarin, show up to that Xamarin workshop that they talked about earlier on today. Okay, we also have our annual conference coming up, Couchbase Connect. There's the address for it up there. I'm sure you guys are all going to book your tickets to Santa Clara right after this meeting. But if you don't want to fly out there to see it, you can also go and register for the live stream and watch all of our sessions online. And we'll also, if you sign up there, we'll send you the recordings when we have them available. So don't miss that. Lots of great content from us and from our customers who are there at the conference. If the other people didn't steal all the stickers, those will be the ones I could give you. If you really want a sticker, if you like any of these, just come see me. I will promise you I will mail you a sticker, at least one sticker, for your trouble. They wiped me out last night. I'm so sorry.
Those dogs and all that stuff.
Well, actually, yeah, it was mostly Austin.
And as weird as they are.
This is a picture of my lovely family waiting for me at home in Ohio. See them tomorrow. They're all a bunch of shrimps. This is where you can find us online at Couchbase, all of our various websites. Go check out the blog.couchbase if you had questions about the blob storage, the non-JSON storage. I just did a blog post about that. You can follow me on Twitter at mgroves.
So is this how all your family pictures are?
Pretty much. Pretty much. Although my son there is 8 and my daughter is 6. And they're about an inch apart right now, less than an inch apart. So she might be taller than everybody else at some point. So we'll see. Okay, like I said, I'll stay around as long as you guys want me to or until you kick me out. But other than that, thank you very much for having me here. I really appreciate it.